Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Breakers. My name is Tanner, and as usual, I will be joined by Taylor. Also, this is a very special episode since we do have a guest. But before we jump into those things, we do have a couple of patrons we would like to welcome. I want to give a shout out to James and also to Matthew. So really running down the list of apostles here.
I'm looking out for Judas. Where is he?
We probably shouldn't let him in. I've heard things. So thanks so much for supporting the show, and we hope you enjoy the bonus material. We actually just started work on the next Dead Reckoning episode, number 6, and we'll have a main bonus episode out sometime with what's left of November. With those Dead Reckoning episodes, we did unlock the first one of those that we recorded. If you want to check those out and see what you're getting yourself into. And then those monthly bonus episodes, we do some stuff that's a little bit more out of the box, some things that are maybe a little bit more fun. We'll talk about movies, crazy adventures, things like that. So for anyone who's considering the Patreon, you can check some of those things out that we've unlocked and see how you feel about it. And then, just think about it, sit with your thoughts, and decide if you want to give us either $3 or $5 a month. So with all that, please welcome our special celebrity guest, Ian.
Do you ever call me a celebrity guest again, then I'll leave immediately. Instead of celebrity guest, hey, we've got another Duluthian on the podcast.
Right.
That area of the country is a rich vein of both iron ore and podcast guests.
Yeah, that's all that's here. Iron ore, boats, and people who are interested in shipwrecks far too much and stick with it for far too long.
Yeah, the Duluth set, if you will, has been some of our most ardent supporters. So we appreciate all of the attention that we get from you guys in Duluth. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you do?
Yeah, I'd love to. So I work for the Minnesota Historical Society. I work for Split Rock Lighthouse. Went to college at UMD, got my degrees there, and have always been fascinated by boats, shipping, and eventually, as time went on, lighthouses. I've been working at the lighthouse for 6 years, maybe. And I've traveled all around the U.S. And I've seen a couple in Ireland as well. I've seen probably around 200 to 300, far too many lighthouses that anybody should be allowed to see. But I live in Duluth, and I am, as I said, very proud Duluthian. I love the city of Duluth.
Awesome. Yeah, Duluth really is an awesome city. I know from my brief time living in Superior, going over there and everything, it was always great. It's fun. A lot of
come on now,
stuff.
Superior's got a good view of Duluth. That's what they got
exactly.
I think I've only been up that way once, when it was to move you into your dorm, Taylor.
Yeah, probably.
Also, what's the name of the lighthouse that you work at?
I work at Split Rock Lighthouse.
Split Rock. Okay. I thought you'd said that. That is certainly a lot of lighthouses that you've been to. Most recently, I was up in Door County. There's a couple lighthouses up there. And, talking with our dad just about the general shape of lighthouses and how those in Door County, if what you're more familiar with is the Outer Banks lighthouses with your more like tower style, it's like those literally do just look like a house that someone put a light on top of.
And that's the crazy thing too, because across the U.S. Lighthouse Service and the U.S. Lighthouse Establishment, they had 3 primary types of lighthouses. It was bearing lighthouses, which were used strictly for navigation bearings, so they can get their bearings. And then there was hazard lighthouses, and those are all still used. There's still like a random shoal or a reef somewhere. And then harbor lights, and they're all still used and automated to this day. So
that was actually one of the cool things. And it was, I think, for one of our Dead Reckoning episodes where we talked about kind of the evolving nature of lighthouses and how in like the late 1700s, early 1800s, the U.S. building up the system of lighthouses. And something I'd never really thought about was how lighthouses traditionally, historically, were more of, attracting someone to a safe harbor, saying this is where you should go, compared to warning people away from dangerous areas. So yeah, I've definitely in the course of making this show, I've become more aware and interested in lighthouses. So very cool to have a lighthouse expert on here with us.
Yeah, lighthouses are boat adjacent.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So the other segment we always start with here is our media check-in. So Ian, what have you gotten yourself up to lately in terms of reading, listening, watching?
Yeah. Recently, I am a massive Tolkien lover. Okay. Always have been since I was really young. And I recently picked up this book, J.R.R. Tolkien, Authors of the Century, by Tom Shippey. And it is a linguistic and historical perspective of his work. And it's really cool to see someone in the field of one of my favorite writers talk about him writing. It's really interesting. And I can't put it down.
Absolutely.
Awesome. That sounds really cool. My ears perked up a little bit there. Taylor, how about you?
I have continued Into the Abyss by Max Hastings. It's really good. I just love it. You could kind of line all of his books up and read them back to back to do it in order. And it's just, he has a really interesting take on things. He's able to focus on the macro parts of it, but still like humanize it, which I think is hard to do sometimes in histories. And I don't know. It's excellent. I would highly recommend this, just like all of his other books that I've read.
Cool.
I think also I've been continuing with Blowback, and they're talking about the Korean War. And it's funny how much of that bleeds into the Cuban Missile stuff and how all of these different things, we think of them as isolated events, but they're, they're all connected. There's all these pressures that you're not thinking about. So it's great. It's been a lot of fun.
Yes, for me, well, obviously today the World Cup started, so I watched that.
Yes,
did you watch that?
Oh,
I did not actually watch any of it because I figured that Ecuador would take care of business, but I fully intend on watching all of tomorrow's game if I'm up by 8.
Yeah, definitely a thorough handling from Ecuador for the hosts today. I was thinking about this, though. There's a small part of me that does feel a little bit of sympathy for the Qatari players, because if they get thoroughly embarrassed, which they probably will, kind of like today, it will just be more fuel to the fire of they didn't deserve to be in it. They just bought their way in, da-da-da-da-da. But if the opposite happens and they go on one of those, Disney fairy tale magical runs and they, win some games and make it to the knockouts, well, of course, no one's going to believe it's authentic. So,
right. Yeah, they're stuck in a difficult spot.
Kind of in a lose-lose there. So anyway, aside from that, I finished up a book called American War Poetry. It's edited by Laurie Goldenson. And it was really cool. It's a survey of war poetry from the colonial era all the way up through 21st century conflicts. So obviously it covers a huge span of time. You get to kind of watch the national outlook evolve a little bit. You've got the expected emphasis in that collection on like the Civil War and World War I.
Right.
Probably two of the wars that we associate with poetry, probably the most. So those were interesting. And even with World War I, a lot of the stuff that you read is from British writers. And I hadn't read as much from an American perspective. But then also some really early stuff, some revolutionary stuff I'd never read. And especially post, World War I, World War II, stuff like Korea and Vietnam. And you really see the themes shifting and kind of reflecting the whole American outlook.
That's so amazing. Oh my God. Just to have the timeline like that. Oh my God.
Even from like a technical perspective, just seeing the poetry itself evolve, where you have like the very measured, calculated verses early on, like this is the form you follow. And then a lot of the later stuff, especially getting into there's stuff from Kosovo, from, the Gulf Wars, where it's almost entirely free verse, very stream of consciousness type stuff. A little bit of something for everyone. There's very good commentary in it also. So excellent book, I would say, for anyone interested in poetry.
Yeah, that sounds awesome.
So with all of that, I guess we're ready to get into the main sequence of the episode. So I guess we'll just let Ian take it away.
Cool. So we're going to be talking about the Madeira/Madeira. I have heard both a million times. So throughout this recording, I'm probably going to go back and forth in between the two names. But the Madeira was a schooner class vessel that was first built by the Chicago Shipbuilding Company in 1900. And of course, 1900, she'd be shipping through the Great Lakes, especially with the recent-ish discovery of iron ore in the Mesaba Iron Range, which I was just reading recently. A study has put forward that shows a couple of the mines on the range have enough ore to be mined for another 200 years.
Wow.
Nice.
Which is like, to think that we have like the progression of the post-industrial period to 2022 and they're still mining there is, oh my God.
Yeah,
that's crazy.
That's amazing from like a technological perspective to think that with all of the modern methods that we use to extract that stuff, you'd still get that much time out of it.
Yeah. Versus like what they were doing when they were first mining in the mid 1880s.
Right. We kind of talked about that when we talked about the I think it was the San Pedro de Alcantara. We were talking about the Spanish mines in Peru, and the idea that 200 years after conquering the Inca, like they're still pulling gold and silver out of the ground.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's interesting, especially with that region, how much there is there.
Yeah. So when the Madeira was built, she was launched in 1900. 1900, and she was 436 feet, which through a lot of my research, that's really big for the time period, especially for a barge of that time. I don't know if they were planning on making more of this hull type, or if they did, or what the plan was. Who knows how well it worked out for them?
So she was explicitly built as a barge. Is that what you said?
I have heard a couple of different things from a couple different documents. I've found a couple that state that she was on the water as a bulk carrier for a very short period of time and then transferred to a barge.
Okay.
It's one of those things where it's kind of it's a bit of a niche vessel outside of this area, so I'm not really sure. But all I've found is leading to it was a barge.
Yeah, that is interesting because I know that's something that happened to a lot of these schooners. As they got older, they would turn them into barges. But yeah, I would imagine some would have been purposely built as well. So I guess there would be a good chance that she was.
It's like the late career catcher to first base transition.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, exactly. And especially with it being of that time, like just rip out those steam engines, turn it into a barge, and then we can make double the money by paying for only this much of a crew and this much of coal and yada, 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 which is incredible. The barges at this time, there were many times where these boats were pulled multiple barges at the same time. Again, one of those things where you feel like, why? It seems like way too big of a risk. But as she went through her first 2 years, nothing really happened until 1902. In 1902, the Madeira actually grew a bit of news as she ran into the International Bridge at Sault Ste. Marie, which I just seeing in recent years and even vessels of the past, 40 years, you do get this worldwide news of a barge running in, or like the Suez a couple of years ago, reaching to that point. But that all really changes in 1905, where we have the Mataafa blow, the Mataafa storm, and which I've always thought is funny, at least in my area. I wanted to ask you guys. The 1905 storm is often called the storm of the century, all along the north shore of Minnesota, which I haven't heard anywhere else.
Yeah, I will say in the times in my daily life when the Mataafa storm comes up, I've never
Yeah,
heard it
as
called.
it does.
I've
as
never heard
should.
it. Yeah, even the stuff that like reading wise, I guess I
Right.
think of it as one of those. I think of that one. I think of the 1913. I think of the Armistice Day storm, and I guess I don't think of the Mataafa storm as like standing out over the others necessarily. But
No,
I don't
don't
know
either.
that much about it. So
Right.
Yeah, I don't either. I always kind of default to like the 1913 storm.
this would be a question for. This would be good to have Brianna analyze for us. And
Yeah,
just
tell
look
us
at-
which
look at-
one's
Look at
worse.
the data here.
Yeah. But the 1905 shipping season was not good before the storm. That season alone had seen 183 sailor deaths in Lake Superior alone before the storm. And this is still very much the era when you have people living along the lake and somebody's out for a stroll and they find somebody. And they're like, oh, that was just one of those darn shipwrecks that happens out there all the time.
That's like one of those little horrors that we don't have to deal with today regularly. But back in the day, like you could just be walking down the beach and it's like, oh, there he is. There's a body.
There's somebody.
It was just like a normal thing that happened. It's crazy.
Put him with the others.
And leading up to the November 27th, November 28th, and a few days afterwards, the Madeira was being pulled along by the William Edenborn, which at the time was the Queen of the Lakes. So this is where things start getting bad. In Duluth on November 27th.
I have a question quick.
Yes, go ahead.
More of an interjection here. I only throw this in here because it connects to our big season finale episodes that we're going to do. We talked sometimes about the names with these ships and who they're named for. Do you know anything about William Edenborn, either of you?
I do not.
I have that somewhere in my notes. I believe he was named after one of... It's always the rich industrialist.
I say this in teacher fashion in that, like, I have things that I want to say about
Oh,
him.
no, go ahead, please. Oh, my God.
And again, I don't want to say too much because he will come back up and be kind of a big character in one of our episodes on the Lusitania.
Oh, no.
He was a super bigwig in Louisiana in like the late 18 and early 1900s. And he had his fortune via, I believe it was that he patented a machine for making barbed wire.
Okay.
So I guess you didn't have, I guess you made it by hand before that, which sounds like a pretty terrible job.
Right.
So anyway, he had a lot of money and then he had that and he ended up selling off his business to JP Morgan and all of that ended up getting folded into what became US Steel.
Interesting.
So he's involved with that. He was very active in the German American community in Louisiana, which I didn't really know existed until I started reading for the Lusitania stuff. And he was very, very much associated with the like true neutrality movement, as many German Americans were, trying to keep the U.S. out of World War I, to the extent that, he would give speeches and he would, be at all the German American Society events, to the extent that in 1918, he was actually charged under the Sedition Act for... Honestly, on pretty weak stuff. It was just him making comments that Germany wasn't really an existential threat to the U.S., which is probably objectively true, but obviously at the time was going to make you look suspicious, especially if you spent the whole war hanging out with all your German friends. So anyway, I wanted to throw that in there just because he's an interesting character. And we'll definitely we'll come back to him in our Lusitania episodes. And
yeah, oh my God.
I was doing that research, and then as I looked through your notes, Ian, I was like, wait a second. I know this guy. I know this guy. Yeah. All right. Anyway, back to your story. No,
you're good. And please interject throughout. I know this story like the back of my hand. I as you can guess, this is near the vicinity of Split Rock Point, or what would become Split Rock Point, but we'll get to that later. But November 27th comes in. Duluth 50-mile-an-hour winds are measured, and there is a low-pressure cyclone system moving in, as it always does in November in northern Minnesota. Storm flags were raised later that night as winds were reaching upwards of 60 miles per hour to 75, with a 50 below wind chill.
Yikes.
Fahrenheit.
Yeah.
And you gotta just imagine the kind of things that all of these boats that were out there saw, and really what they didn't see with a storm like that.
Right.
It was so bad, in fact, I have a quote from our captain of the Edenborn. I believe, the snow was so thick and so blinding that we could not see half of the length of our ship in any direction, and the sea piling over the stern in volumes of solid water. That was by Captain A.J. Talbot of the Edenborn, the vessel that was tugging the Madeira. And this kind of calls back to one of your guys' episodes that I think about a lot, is when you have people like captains or first mates or first engineers saying things like this, whether before, during, or after, I imagine like the lowest ranking sailors, like a porter or a deckhand, hearing their captain say something like that.
Right.
What do they think? Oh my gosh.
And yeah, I mean, just looking at, that's some of the coldest temperatures I think we've really even talked about on the show. Negative 50 wind chill, which is like negative 45 Celsius. But that's insane, to the idea of not just being in that weather, but having to be on a ship and, potentially out doing stuff.
In an old straight decker boat in the middle of Lake Superior. So waves are growing as well. They're looking at anywhere between 30 to 40 feet in swells. And on November 28th at approximately 3:30 a.m., the Madeira is being tugged along by the Edenborn on the northern coast of Minnesota's North Shore. And right in front of Gold Rock Point, the two boats separate. Now, this is where we kind of get some contention as to what will happen. It's one of those things that we'll never really know. Captain Reed, I believe, of the Madeira, thinks that it is possible that... Captain Dessett of the Edenborn said that Captain Reed did not cut the line, that it most likely snapped. But we have examples of, it was a common thing. If you were towing a barge at that time, the commonality was you would cut the line so you didn't have to tip, and the boat behind you would have a far better chance.
We've definitely talked about that in some of the other stories we've done on here. And there's always kind of that debate after the fact of like, well, should they, shouldn't they? And I think those guys in the situation have to know what's best, right? Like they've done this before.
Yeah, I know we had one of those instances in the 1913 storm episode of cutting the barge loose and hoping you can come back for them later and then never see them again. But also more specifically on this kind of not knowing, did this snap or was this cut? It's just like what we had with the Sea Wing, Taylor, that you did, where that was a big thing in the aftermath of, was it cut loose for stability purposes? Was it going to sink the Sea Wing if it wasn't cut loose? Those are always interesting when we have some discrepancy like that in the story.
Yeah, it is.
And even honestly, with the snap thing, I mean, you got to think about what the wires were made of. You've got these 50 degrees below zero, 30-foot waves. You're rocking back and forth. Totally possible it just snapped.
Absolutely.
So the Captain Talbot and his crew of the Edenborn continue south as the Madeira is detached. They actually run aground in the Split Rock River, which is about 1.5 miles, 2 miles south of where Gold Rock Point is. And they slam into it. And I believe there was one fatality from the crew just from running aground, and a man being jerked from the vessel onto land. Or if he was below deck. The boat was a loss, and those men were able to stay and shelter themselves inside the wreckage of the boat. At the same time, about 2 miles south of here, you've got this crew on the Madeira. They're cut from their barge or their tug. They're rocking back and forth. They have no power. They have no engines. They have no lights. And they're just getting closer and closer to Gold Rock Point.
Yeah, then that like really is the worst case scenario too. We always talk about that with these, is like no power is not good. Like you are at the mercy of the lake at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine these guys that happen, and they're like, all right, well, this is it. We're dead. Like there's nothing else to do. And as they get closer and closer to the shore, the Madeira ends up kind of sideways and pinning itself onto Gold Rock Point, which is this rock of primarily anorthosite and a little bit of corundum and a lot of gold lichen. It makes it look gold. And the cliff is about 65 to 75 feet up, completely pinned. And the boat is obviously listing a little bit. And again, this situation, there is nothing you can do. One man tries to throw a rope and is completely unsuccessful. And then we enter the Giga Chad of the Great Lakes. I'd like to introduce everybody to a man named Fred Benson.
Oh.
We have very little information about this man. What we know is he was a rookie sailor. He was a very low-ranking sailor, 17, 18, 19 years old. We'll never know. He's on the bow of the Madeira. And as the waves are coming in and coming out, he looks over the side of the boat and sees that when the waves go out, that there is a rock jutting out from the cliff. And as the waves come back in, that rock gets completely covered. So Fred grabs a length of rope and times his jump between waves coming in and waves going out. He lands on the rock and immediately jumps to the cliff. Again, this is like 60, 75-foot cliff. There's 30-foot waves. It would have been covered in ice. And as each wave came in, he would have had to pin himself against the rock to hold on for dear life.
It's very much I'm Fred Benson and this is Jackass.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
I was going to say, is this like a dude's rock for good like moment right here?
Yeah, it is.
Also, I think there it's interesting you mentioned how young and how inexperienced he is. I feel like in a situation like that, it's like you'd almost have to be to try something like that.
Yes, you would.
I feel like if someone more experienced with the lakes would be thinking like, well, that's suicide. There's no way that's going to work.
I also think 18-year-olds in 1905 are just built different, probably.
Yeah, they were built. Yeah.
He's been sailing for 10 years actually, so
he got that dog in him.
Yeah.
So Fred proceeds to climb this cliff and holding himself on as each wave batters him and batters him and batters him. And he gets to the top and he ties a rock to the rope and lowers it down the cliff to the crew at the bow and is able to hoist up and help them climb back up to the top of this cliff. He does the same thing with the men who are trapped at the stern of the vessel. So you have this guy lowering this rope back down multiple times. It was a full crew of 11 who was on the Madeira. And once they get to the last guy on the boat, the last man on the boat was the first mate. His name was John Mardo. And Mardo made a mistake that would prove fatal. He decided to climb the mast and wanted to jump from the mast to Fred's rope. But by the time he did that, he got to the top, he was like, oh, this is really stupid. I shouldn't do this. And unfortunately, as John went back down on the mast, as soon as he stepped on the deck of the Madeira snapped and collapsed and sucked him into the depths of Lake Superior, where he would be the only fatality of the wreck.
Shades of our episode on the Edmund in Kilkee Bay, where you had a ship stuck on the rocks, and I believe it was the ship's carpenter, who'd been running people in and out, helping people get to safety. And then as he goes to grab his stuff to leave the ship, kind of the similar thing, the ship breaks up, and I think he's the only crew member there who's killed in the sinking. So some tragic parallels here.
Yeah, I'm not surprised that you have similar stories like this happening across the board, where you have these dire straits situations and it just comes down to one last person and there's never enough time with these guys. Let me know if you guys know where the love of God goes when the waves turn into 2 hours. So you have nearly the full crew alive, except for John, who did not make it. The rest of the crew is on the top of Gold Rock Point. Now, you need to remember, they're still in the middle of nowhere. There is nothing. There is a small dirt road connecting 2 harbors to Beaver Bay, and they're in the middle of scenic nowhere. At least it looks beautiful, but they're not concerned with that. After a little bit of hiking, they ended up going about a mile south, and they found the old fishing village of Little Two Harbors. Little Two Harbors was a small Norwegian, primarily herring fishing town where there was maybe 18 maximum, all men, fishermen, and they bunkered in with them incredibly, walking through the wilderness. None of these guys have been there. They're just, we're going to go this way. The Captain Tissette did end up having frostbite on both of his hands and feet. And he would later go on to have a lot of back troubles from just the initial slamming of the Madeira into Gold Rock Point. And he has a cheeky little quote from the Duluth Evening Herald in which he states the experience was a little worse for the tough experience, which is just like, oh my God, I understand you guys got to be cool, but you guys went through hell.
Right.
On Earth.
How does everyone not have frostbite in that situation?
I feel like to have it noted as having frostbite means you had really bad frostbite.
I'm
assuming
everyone had it was like black, like like the kind you have to amputate from.
The kind that doesn't buff out.
You don't buff out that kind of stuff. So our guys are hanging out inside of this little fishing town. It's not even a town. It's like 2 houses and a dock, which is in where currently Pebble Beach in Split Rock State Park. If you go, there's a little island called Ellingston Island. It's just near there. And a few days passes, and the Edna G, the wonderful and amazing old tug from 2 harbors, is patrolling the area, finds the men of the Edenborn, gets them on board, takes them back to their families, or back to 2 harbors, Duluth, and then they could catch a train to wherever. And they end up going north as well, and they go to Little 2 Harbors, and they find the crew, and they're able to return them back to their families as well. And one thing that has always astounded me when it comes to what happens next is Fred Benson goes back to Duluth. Has a couple little mentions in a handful of newspapers. I believe it was again the Evening Bulletin, or the I think it's the Evening Bulletin, and he is called a Norwegian Hercules at one point, whilst another newspaper calls him a human squirrel. If given the opportunity to be remembered for one thing, I think I'm going to go with the human squirrel.
Absolutely.
I like how those 2 monikers, they emphasize the very different skills involved in the rescue. As the one emphasized like how strong you have to be to like rescue these people, and the other more about how nimble you'd have to be to climb up this cliff and survive. So that's interesting.
That's fun.
So that all happens. Duluth is also very much in shock, as most of the population is still recovering from seeing the Mataafa wreck downtown, which I'm sure will be talked about at some point. And a handful of the crew meet back up with the Edna G, and they go back north looking for the wreck. They find the wreck, and they start the process of collecting pieces of the wreck site. And whilst one of the first crews that went down there in a hard hat diver, they actually find John, the first mate who passed away, and returned him to his family. Which, again, I can't believe something like that happening. And just like it's not very often where you have shipwreck disasters in the Great Lakes where the families are often given that levity of being able to bury their loved ones or to have a service for their loved ones or whatever they need to do.
Yeah, it's interesting how that obviously like the bar has shifted in this situation because it's not a good outcome, but yeah, it's like that.
No,
that's a big deal. Like just to be able to have that when so many families don't in these situations.
Yeah. This storm is, as we were talking in the beginning, quite memorable for many reasons. 36 lives in total were lost to this storm, and 29 vessels had sank, ran aground, or were damaged during this storm, which at the time was the worst the region had seen. And as this is moving forward, the people at U.S. Steel, all these other industries who are using the freighters for bulk grain or what have you, have much more concern to protect their investments, shall we say, rather than the crews and people. Which, again, that's how it was back then. Not much. That's still how it is. But we'll get. That's a whole different conversation. But they end up really coming down on Congress at the time, and Congress in 1905, that same year. The U.S. Lighthouse Service had shifted from the Department of Treasury to the Department of Commerce. And a few recent years before that, the lighthouse establishment had changed its name to the U.S. Lighthouse Service. And through said pressure, what have you, whatever it really was, a bill was passed that allotted for $3 million in total to build light stations around the Great Lakes, and a unnamed point between Gold Rock Point, where the Madeira sank, and Little Two Harbors, there was an unnamed point. And they purchased it after not being able to buy the original land they wanted. They went with this unnamed point, and they named it after the river just south of it, and it became Split Rock Point. And this is where you have the construction of Split Rock Lighthouse. $75,000 was allotted. The station was built in 11 months total, ahead of schedule and under budget, and remains one of the most photographed lighthouses in the United States. And not completely due to the lighthouse, obviously, but since the building of said lighthouse, there wasn't another wreck in the vicinity of Split Rock Point, of Corundum Point, and of Gold Rock in that area.
Yeah, I do think that light is one of the most picturesque lights that exists. It doesn't look like a Great Lakes lighthouse. Like if you could tell me that that's in the Pacific Northwest, and I would believe you.
Yeah, it does have a lot of similarities to a lot of like California lighthouses.
Yeah, I'm looking at a picture of it right now, and it's just like that sheer cliff face.
Yeah.
What a perfect spot.
Yeah, the the architect of the lighthouse, his name was Ralph Russell Tinkham. This was his second lighthouse that he had designed. This was his first solo piece. But he before this had aided in the construction of Rock of Ages lighthouse on Isle Royale. And Split Rock really became his kind of, stamp. And later on in his career, he would become kind of a bigwig with the U.S. Lighthouse Service. He would go on to join the committee and help orchestrate and design many lighthouses throughout the United States, both coasts, even Hawaii, I believe.
Yeah, I bet he was taking pictures of that thing to the bars. Showing it.
Yeah.
Hey, I did that.
Are you winning, son?
I had a question or something I wanted to at least mention on here. I was looking through some of the stuff that you had posted in the folder. The storm in general, I thought this was interesting to see how many of those was it U.S. Steel ships.
Yes,
were lost in the storm. I was just fascinated to see that that so many, or I don't know, it may have been all of the casualties in the storm were from the same, shipping company, which is on the one hand a bit weird, but on the other, looking at how many ships this company owned, it's also kind of like, well, the odds are good that would happen. So I just thought that was a fascinating part of the Mataafa storm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that perfectly leads into why they really came down after such a massive loss in life, but in their eyes more so in product and materials for the United States at the time.
And if I remember correctly, I think I also saw that none of the ships were insured.
No. God, no. Again.
Yeah, I bet they were pretty mad about losing all of those.
You look at this information, or you go to a library and you look in the records and looking at how the shipping industry worked at like the turn of the century up until really let's say like the 40s into the 50s. It's the Wild West. I can't believe the amount of things that happened and the things that were like, it's fine, don't worry about it.
To plug another bonus episode to everyone, when we did one about a ship called the Richard A. Bingham, a Pensacola lumber schooner, and we had to have discussions about one of the things that ship is known for is their meticulous accounting records. And you read some of the stories about it, and it's like, oh my God, they were keeping records. This was like 1903, and it's like,
oh my God,
this is amazing. Like this is magic. How do you do this? Double entry. What is this?
Oh my God! And do those records still exist? Like, were you able to reference those? I haven't listened to it. So.
Yeah.
That's so cool. Oh my God!
At one point, we cite, I forget what the journal is. It's like Accounting Historian Monthly or something like that.
Yeah.
And just what a horrendous sounding magazine.
Real page turner.
It's like famous in the accounting community for like, oh, this is like one of the reasons we know how people did this in the early 1900s. This and like two other ships where we have these meticulous records kept where, hey, they're actually noting what these expenses are for. They're actually itemizing these expenses on the voyage. You could kind of just do whatever you wanted.
Yeah.
And the wreck today, it isn't actually classified as a shipwreck anymore. It's a debris field, which, you can't not be at the bottom of Lake Superior since 1905 and not still be in wonderful shape. But throughout the time of its wrecks, there was multiple dives that went down, both by the company, recollecting items, things that they could, but also before the modern era of museum interpretation and museum collections. There was a lot of dives where people would go down there and take trinkets and things. The wreck itself is a bit of a complicated dive because it's just so spread out over it. There are pieces of the wreck that are on the shore that you can see, and then there's pieces that are 80 feet underwater. I've kayaked over it a handful of times. You can see sections of it. The pilot house still stands. That's like the main thing. And just recently, I was attending a little talk that we had at the lighthouse with some shipwreck historians and divers. One of the boilers has been discovered, which is really weird because the boiler means that it would have come from the Edenborn, or if it would have come from the Madeira. I wasn't able to listen to the whole thing, but also the location-wise of where it was is like way out off of the tip of this point. And there haven't been too many surveys of it since then. But there's a handful of websites online that have some really pretty cool 3D models of the wreck. There's going to be a VR dive of it by a couple institutions, I believe, that they're going to publish, along with some 3D digital scans being put into 3D print, which I'm not sure where they're going to be going, but I've heard murmurs of them.
That's really cool. I love seeing, how much with like modern technology and just being able to like disseminate information. I love seeing that happen, with these ships that aren't even, particularly famous or widely known, but seeing the effort that goes into sharing and preserving those stories is really awesome.
Yeah, it's really cool. And talking with those divers at the Shipwreck Society, their eyes just like lit up apparently, because a lot of those guys are like, I never thought I'd be able to see whatever wreck that they scan in, and now they can just sit in the comfort of their home and not have to put on a dry suit and suffer diving the Gitch.
For me, it's like, let's be honest, I'm never going to dive on a shipwreck.
No,
not going to happen. Yeah, like giving that little bit of access is really amazing what we can do with technology now. Any wrap-ups, final thoughts on the Madeira or the Mataafa storm or lighthouses?
Don't get me going. The Madeira is just one small story in a collection of a massive storm with hundreds of thousands of stories. And if you're not familiar with the 1905 storm, to any of the listeners, or the Mataafa story itself, look that up or stay tuned. I'm sure something like that will be talked about at some point.
Yeah, for sure. I know Mataafa is one that we have in our in our sites to cover at some point. Just another piece of that, big story. That's cool. Are there? I mean, it's like Superior, so the odds are good. But are there other wrecks in the immediate vicinity of Split Rock Light?
So there's a handful. North of where Split Rock is, there was the Hesper, which sank, and it is currently right next to the Silver Bay Marina, actually. And they put out a break wall, and I believe they had to adjust where they placed the break wall because the wreck was right there. Or maybe it was discovered. I don't recall off the top of my head. But then there was south of Split Rock and south of Split Rock River, even, there was the Lafayette as well, which also went down in the 1905 storm. And then there's all the really well-known wrecks up at Isle Royale that everybody loves, whether they're the America and the Kamloops, I believe.
The Kamloops, I know, is one that we talked about a little bit on our Halloween episode.
Oh, yeah. Old Whitey. Yeah, you guys remember. Yeah, we were talking about Old Whitey. Pour one out for Old Whitey.
Well, cool. I guess if that wraps everything up, then
I
will just say, that was very cool. That was an excellent discussion. Thank you for sharing some of your knowledge with us.
Thanks for having me on.
We're always happy to be back in Lake Superior to talk about a shipwreck. Yeah, so we hope everyone enjoys this episode. In terms of things coming up, schedule-wise, next week, we're still kind of planning out. But then the week after that, we'll be starting into our 3-part series on Big Lucy, the Lusitania herself. So we are definitely looking forward to that. A lot of work obviously going into those episodes, but we're very excited to see how those come out and share those with you. So with all that, I will say one final thank you to Ian, and have a great week and take care.